Since the 1840s, the Deaton family farmed this ground. Their big draft horse Solomon did most of the work. In 1891, federal revenue agents came through looking.
Mountain Giant. The Deaton clan slaughtered 21 lawmen who shot their giant workhorse, the deadliest act of rural vengeance in North Carolina history and the bloodiest conflict between farmers and lawmen the Blue Ridge Mountains had ever witnessed. This is the true story of the Deaton clan. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Madison County, North Carolina, known simply as the High Country. Rarely have these hills been without some sort of warfare or smoldering quarrel that was likely at any moment to burst into rifle fire. Hemmed in by the ancient Blue Ridge Mountains, the early settlers who lived along the French Broad River and its countless tributaries were cut off from the outside world. And for over 200 years, each succeeding generation remained that way. There were no telephones and the roads were few, and travel was slow and tedious. Indeed, the advance of civilization in the outside world had skirted this mountainous region that had gained the reputation of being one of the most isolated and fiercely independent sections in all of America. From the early period when the hardy mountaineers fought the Indians all the way up until the 20th century, the inhabitants of this area had a tendency to take law into their own hands and to hand out justice according to their own ideas. This no doubt has been due in part to the fact that law and order has had a hard time trying to gain a foothold in this section of sparsely settled mountains. And during the 1800s and even well into the 1900s, most of the region's inhabitants were farmers who lived a simple existence. Most of them lived in log cabins, surviving by working the thin mountain soil and raising livestock that could thrive on the steep hillsides. Schools and churches were few and far between. In fact, most children didn't even attend school, and those that did rarely did so for more than just a few months a year. You see, in these mountains, a man's animals were more than mere property. They were partners in the endless struggle for survival, companions through long days of back-breaking labor, members of the family in everything but name. A good workhorse or mule was worth more than gold to a mountain farmer, because without such an animal the steep fields could not be plowed, the timber could not be hauled, the crops could not be brought to market. To harm a man's working stock was to strike at the very foundation of his existence, to threaten the survival of his family in the most direct way possible. The Deaton clan understood this better than most, because they had built everything they possessed through the labor of their hands and the strength of their animals. For 4 generations, the Deatons had worked the rocky soil of Madison County, clearing forest, building fences, transforming wilderness into productive farmland 1 acre at a time. They were not wealthy by any outside measure, but they were proud and self-sufficient, owing nothing to anyone and asking nothing in return. Their word was their bond, their family was their fortress, and their land was their legacy. That's right. The patriarch of the Deaton clan in 1903 was a man named Jeremiah Deaton, known throughout the county simply as Old Jerry. He was 68 years old that year, a weathered oak of a man who had spent his entire life working the land his grandfather had claimed from the wilderness. Jerry had buried 2 wives and outlived most of his contemporaries. But he still rose before dawn each morning to tend his farm, still split his own firewood, still walked the steep mountain trails with a vigor that men half his age could not match. His word was law within the family, and his reputation in the broader community was one of absolute integrity. Jerry had raised 8 children to adulthood, 6 sons and 2 daughters, and those children had given him over 30 grandchildren who were scattered across the surrounding hollows. The Deaton clan numbered over 50 souls by 1903, all of them bound together by blood and marriage and the shared experience of mountain life. They helped each other in times of need, defended each other against outsiders, and celebrated together the births and marriages and harvests that marked the passage of years. They were a family in the truest sense of the word, and their loyalty to each other was absolute. Among all the possessions that the Deaton clan had accumulated over 4 generations, none was more valuable or more beloved than a draft horse named Goliath. He was a Belgian stallion, the largest horse anyone in Madison County had ever seen, standing over 19 hands at the shoulder and weighing nearly a ton. His coat was a deep chestnut color that gleamed like copper in the sunlight, and his mane and tail were the color of fresh cream. When he walked, the ground seemed to tremble beneath his massive hooves, and when he worked, he could pull loads that would have required 2 or 3 ordinary horses. The story of how Goliath came to the Deaton farm was one that the family told and retold around winter fires for years afterward. Old Jerry had heard rumors of a breeder in Tennessee who raised Belgian draft horses, animals that were virtually unknown in the southern mountains, but that had revolutionized farming in the Midwest. He had traveled 3 days each way to see these horses for himself, and when he first laid eyes on the young stallion that would become Goliath, he knew immediately that this was an animal unlike any other. The breeder had called the horse Samson, but Jerry renamed him Goliath because he was even larger than his biblical namesake suggested. At 3 years old, he already stood taller than any horse in Madison County, and the breeder promised that he would continue growing for another 2 years. His temperament was as remarkable as his size, gentle and patient with humans, but fierce when challenged by other animals. He seemed to understand commands before they were fully spoken, anticipating what was needed, and responding with an intelligence that bordered on uncanny. Goliath had come to the Deaton farm 12 years earlier, purchased as a 3-year-old from that Tennessee breeder who was the only man for hundreds of miles who raised Belgian draft horses. Jerry Deaton had paid more for that horse than he had paid for any other animal in his life, $300 in gold coin that represented years of careful saving. His neighbors considered the purchase foolish, arguing that no horse was worth such a sum, and that the money would have been better spent on additional land or livestock. But Jerry had seen something in the young stallion that others had missed. The journey home from Tennessee had taken 5 days, with Jerry walking alongside the young horse rather than riding him, wanting to establish the bond of trust that would define their relationship for years to come. They stopped each night at farmhouses along the way, and at each stop, people gathered to stare at the massive animal that dwarfed every other horse they had ever seen. By the time Jerry reached Madison County, word of his purchase had spread throughout the region, and a small crowd was waiting at the Deaton farm to see the giant horse for themselves. And over the following years, Goliath had proven Jerry's judgment to be correct, in ways that exceeded even his optimistic expectations. Jerry Deaton had paid more for that horse than he had paid for any other animal in his life, an investment that his neighbors considered foolish at the time. But Jerry had seen something in the young stallion that others had missed, a combination of strength and intelligence and temperament that made him special. And over the following years, Goliath had proven Jerry's judgment to be correct. The horse had transformed the Deaton farming operation in ways that no one could have predicted. With Goliath's strength, the family could clear land that had previously been considered too steep or too rocky to work. They could haul timber from the most remote sections of their property, timber that had been inaccessible before, and that brought premium prices at the sawmill in Marshall. They could plow fields in half the time it had taken before, could pull wagons loaded with twice the weight that ordinary horses could manage. Goliath had single-handedly increased the productivity of the Deaton farm by over 50%, and his offspring, sired with mares from throughout the region, were improving farms across the county. The economic impact of Goliath extended far beyond the Deaton property itself. Farmers from throughout Madison County and beyond brought their mares to be bred with the great stallion, paying stud fees that contributed significantly to the Deaton income. The colts and fillies that resulted from these breedings were larger and stronger than ordinary mountain horses, better able to work the steep terrain and haul heavy loads. Within a few years of Goliath's arrival, his bloodlines were spreading throughout the region, improving farms and increasing productivity wherever they went. Old Jerry had kept careful records of every breeding, tracking which mares had visited and what offspring had resulted. By 1903, Goliath had sired over 60 foals, most of them still working on farms within a day's ride of the Deaton property. These horses were living testaments to his quality, and their performance kept demand for his services high. Farmers who had initially been skeptical of the giant horse had become believers after seeing what his offspring could do, and the waiting list for breedings extended months into the future. But Goliath was more than just a working animal to the Deaton family. He was a symbol of everything they had achieved, a living monument to their success and their determination. Children who grew up on the farm learned to walk by holding onto his massive legs, and they learned to ride on his broad back before they could read or write. Old Jerry spent an hour each evening grooming the horse, talking to him in low tones about the day's work and the plans for tomorrow. The bond between man and animal was as deep as any human relationship, forged through years of shared labor and mutual respect. Now, to understand what happened in 1903, you need to understand the forces that were pressing in on families like the Deatons from all directions. That's right, the old ways of the mountains were under assault from a modern world that had little patience for independent farmers who refused to bow to outside authority. Railroad companies wanted rights of way through valleys that had been farmed for generations. Timber companies wanted access to forests that families had considered their own since before anyone could remember. And county governments, increasingly influenced by business interests, had begun to view mountain communities as obstacles to progress rather than citizens to be served. The county sheriff in 1903 was a man named William Garrett, a former Confederate soldier who had reinvented himself as a law enforcement officer after the war. Garrett was 59 years old and had been sheriff for over a decade, long enough to develop a network of relationships with the business interests that were transforming Madison County. He was not entirely corrupt in the way that some lawmen of his era were, but he understood which side his bread was buttered on, and he had learned to interpret the law in ways that served those who had the power to help or harm his career. The conflict that would destroy the Deaton clan and set in motion one of the bloodiest vendettas in North Carolina history began with a road. The state had authorized construction of a new highway that would connect the mountain communities of Madison County to the larger markets of Asheville and beyond. The proposed route ran directly through Deaton property, cutting across fields that the family had worked for 4 generations and bisecting the hollow that had been their home since the first Deaton ancestor arrived in North Carolina. The road project had been championed by a coalition of businessmen and politicians who stood to profit from the increased commerce it would bring. Land speculators had already begun buying property along the proposed route, anticipating that values would increase once the highway made the region more accessible. Merchants in Marshall dreamed of customers arriving from Asheville with money to spend. Politicians saw an opportunity to bring progress to a region that had long been considered backward and resistant to change. The Deatons had first learned of the proposed route when a surveyor appeared on their property without permission, driving stakes into the ground and measuring distances with equipment that seemed almost magical to people who had never seen such things. Old Jerry had confronted the man, demanding to know what he was doing, and had received an explanation that filled him with both confusion and dread. The state intended to build a road through his property, taking the land whether he agreed or not, compensating him at a rate that bureaucrats in Raleigh would determine. The concept of eminent domain was foreign to mountain people, who believed that the land they had cleared and worked and improved belonged to them absolutely. The idea that a distant government could simply take that land regardless of the owner's wishes seemed like tyranny of the worst kind. Jerry had consulted with lawyers, had written letters to politicians, had done everything within the legal system to challenge the proposed taking. His efforts had delayed the project, but had not stopped it, and by 1903 the pressure from the road's supporters had become intense. The state offered compensation, but the amount was far less than the land was worth, and the Deatons refused to sell. The refusal infuriated the politicians and businessmen who had invested in the road project, expecting to profit from the increased commerce it would bring. They put pressure on Sheriff Garrett to resolve the situation, to find some way to force the Deatons to accept the state's offer or to abandon their land altogether. Garrett resisted at first, knowing the Deatons' reputation and understanding the danger of pushing mountain families too hard. But the pressure continued, and eventually he agreed to take action. And that's when things got ugly, because William Garrett decided that the key to breaking the Deaton clan's resistance was to destroy the thing that made their farming operation viable. You see, the plan that Sheriff Garrett developed in the spring of 1903 was based on a calculation that proved catastrophically wrong. He reasoned that if he could eliminate Goliath, the Deatons would no longer be able to work their steep mountain fields effectively. Their income would decline, their debts would mount, and eventually they would have no choice but to sell their land to pay what they owed. It was a cruel plan, But Garrett convinced himself that it was merely hastening an inevitable process, that the old mountain families would have to give way to progress eventually, regardless of what he did. The pretext for the action came in May, when one of Garrett's deputies claimed to have witnessed Goliath kicking a traveler on the public road that ran past the Deaton property. The claim was almost certainly fabricated, as Goliath was known throughout the county for his gentle temperament, but it provided the legal justification that Garrett needed. He declared the horse to be a public menace and issued an order for its destruction, citing a rarely used statute that allowed the sheriff to eliminate dangerous animals that posed a threat to public safety. Old Jerry Deaton learned of the order on a warm May morning when a neighbor rode up to warn him that deputies were gathering in town with the stated intention of coming to the Deaton farm. Jerry immediately sent word to his sons and grandsons, summoning the clan to defend their property against what they saw as an illegal and unjustified attack. By noon, over 30 armed Deatons had assembled at the main farm, forming a perimeter around the barn where Goliath was stabled. They would not allow the deputies to harm their horse, regardless of what pieces of paper the sheriff might wave. Sheriff Garrett arrived at the Deaton farm just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, leading a force of 15 deputies who had been specially assembled for this operation. He had expected resistance, but the sight of 30 armed men positioned around the property gave him pause. These were not outlaws or criminals, but farmers and family men, people he had known for years, and the determination on their faces made clear that they would fight if pushed. For a long moment, Garrett considered withdrawing, returning another day with a larger force, finding some other way to resolve the situation. But the politicians and businessmen who had pressured him into this action were expecting results, and Garrett knew that backing down would cost him their support. He had staked his reputation on resolving the Deaton problem, and failure was not an option he could afford. So instead of withdrawing, he rode forward to parley with old Jerry, hoping to convince the patriarch that resistance was futile and that compliance would lead to a better outcome for everyone. It was a miscalculation that would cost 21 men their lives. The confrontation at the Deaton farm lasted for over 2 hours, with Sheriff Garrett and old Jerry facing each other across a fence line that might as well have been a battlefront. Garrett explained the legal basis for his order, citing the statute and the deputy's sworn statement about Goliath's alleged attack. Jerry responded that the accusation was a lie, that Goliath had never harmed anyone in his 12 years on the farm, and that no force of deputies would be allowed to touch the horse while any member of the Deaton clan still drew breath. Neither man was willing to back down, and the tension mounted with each passing minute. The Deaton men were positioned in a defensive perimeter that Jerry had designed years earlier for just such an eventuality. They occupied positions behind stone walls, in the upper windows of the barn and cabin, and in natural depressions in the terrain that provided cover while allowing clear fields of fire. Each man knew exactly where he was supposed to be and what his responsibilities were if shooting started. They had practiced this defense during family gatherings, treating it as a game but understanding that someday it might become deadly serious. The deputies, by contrast, were bunched together on the road, exposed and vulnerable, their confidence based on the authority of their badges rather than any tactical advantage. Garrett had not expected armed resistance from farmers, had not imagined that mountain people would stand against the lawful authority of the county sheriff. His force was designed to intimidate, not to fight, and the sight of 30 armed men in prepared positions was something he had no plan to counter. The 2 hours of standoff were filled with arguments, threats, and attempts at negotiation that went nowhere. Garrett offered to delay the execution of his order if Jerry would agree to a hearing before the county judge. Jerry replied that the county judge was in Garrett's pocket and that any hearing would be as corrupt as the order itself. Garrett warned that resistance to lawful authority was a crime that could result in imprisonment or worse. Jerry warned that any deputy who set foot on Deaton property without invitation would not leave alive. What happened next would be disputed for decades, with different witnesses offering different accounts of who fired the first shot. Some claimed that a deputy's weapon discharged accidentally when his horse stumbled on the rocky ground. Others insisted that Garrett ordered his men to open fire when Jerry reached for what appeared to be a weapon, but was actually a handkerchief, What no one disputed was that gunfire erupted without warning, shattering the tense standoff and transforming the Deaton farm into a battlefield. In the chaos that followed, 3 deputies were killed in the first volley of return fire from the Deaton positions. The remaining deputies, caught in a crossfire they had not anticipated, broke and fled toward the road, leaving their dead behind. But as they retreated, one of them managed to reach the barn where Goliath was stabled. Whether this deputy acted on his own initiative or was following orders that had been given before the confrontation began would never be determined. What was determined beyond any doubt was that he put his rifle to the great horse's head and pulled the trigger. Goliath fell where he stood, over a ton of muscle and bone collapsing in an instant, his blood pooling on the barn floor where he had slept for 12 years. The sound of the shot carried clearly to where old Jerry stood, directing the defense of his property. And something broke inside him when he understood what it meant. He had been prepared to fight for his horse, had been willing to die to protect the animal that had become like a member of his family. But he had not been prepared for this, for the casual cruelty of killing a creature whose only crime was being valuable to people the sheriff wanted to destroy. The deputy who killed Goliath did not survive to explain his actions. 2 of Jerry's grandsons caught him before he could escape the barn, and what they did to him would not be discussed in polite company for years afterward. By the time the shooting stopped and the surviving deputies had fled, 7 lawmen lay dead or dying on the Deaton property, and the great horse whose death had precipitated the violence lay still in his stall, his copper coat stained dark with blood. That night, gathered in the main cabin of the Deaton homestead, with Goliath's body lying in the barn where he had lived his entire adult life, the clan made a solemn vow. Every man who had participated in the attack on their property would pay with his life. The sheriff, who had ordered the operation, the deputies who had carried it out, the politicians who had pressured Garrett into action, everyone who bore any responsibility for what had happened would face the judgment of the Deaton clan. Before they were done, 21 men would die, and the name Deaton would become synonymous with vengeance throughout the Blue Ridge Mountains. And that vow, spoken over the body of a horse they had loved like a member of the family, would be fulfilled to the letter over the following 18 months. You see, the Deaton clan didn't strike randomly or impulsively, despite their overwhelming grief and rage. That's right. They understood that emotion-driven violence would only get them killed before they could accomplish their purpose. Instead, they spent the weeks following Goliath's death gathering intelligence, compiling a complete list of everyone who had participated in the attack or who bore responsibility for ordering it, and developing plans for how each target would be eliminated. They buried Goliath in a grave befitting his size and his importance to the family, a massive pit dug by hand over the course of 2 days, and they transformed their grief into something cold and systematic. The burial of Goliath was itself a significant event, attended by over 100 people from throughout the county who came to pay their respects to an animal they had known and admired. The great horse was lowered into his grave using ropes and pulleys, the same equipment he had pulled so many times during his working life. Old Jerry spoke words over the grave that combined elements of Christian prayer with the older mountain traditions of honoring animals who had served faithfully. There were tears on faces that rarely showed emotion, and there was a cold anger that would not be satisfied until blood had answered blood. The planning for the vendetta began that same night, while the funeral feast was still being cleaned away. Old Jerry gathered his sons and eldest grandsons in the main cabin and laid out his vision for what they would do. This would not be a series of random attacks, but a systematic campaign to eliminate everyone who bore responsibility for what had happened. They would compile a list, prioritize targets, develop specific plans for each killing, and execute those plans with the same patience and attention to detail that had characterized everything the Deaton clan had ever done. The intelligence-gathering phase took nearly 3 weeks, during which the family appeared to be in mourning, and the outside world assumed they were defeated. But behind the appearance of grief, the Deatons were building a picture of their enemies that was more complete than any of those enemies could have imagined. They identified everyone who had been present at the confrontation, everyone who had pressured Garrett into action, everyone who had provided legal or political cover for the order to destroy Goliath. No role was too small to notice, no participant too peripheral to escape attention. The list they compiled eventually contained 24 names, though 3 of those men would flee the state before the brothers could reach them. At the top was Sheriff William Garrett himself, the man who had conceived and executed the plan. Next came the deputies who had survived the initial confrontation and the one who had actually pulled the trigger on Goliath, though that man was already dead. The remaining names included politicians who had pressured Garrett, businessmen who had invested in the road project and demanded results, and county officials who had provided the legal cover for the sheriff's actions. The clan divided responsibilities according to their individual skills and positions within the family. Old Jerry, too old for the physical demands of the vendetta, served as the strategic coordinator, making final decisions about timing and targets. His eldest son, Ezekiel, commanded the operations that required multiple men. The younger sons and grandsons handled individual killings, working alone or in pairs depending on the difficulty of reaching the target. Every member of the clan had a role to play, and every member understood the stakes involved. The first killing came 3 weeks after Goliath's death, on a moonless June night when Deputy William Carson was walking home from a tavern in the town of Marshall. Carson had been one of the deputies present at the Deaton farm, and he had been overheard boasting about his role in the confrontation to anyone who would listen. He claimed to have killed 2 Deaton men, a lie that earned him free drinks, but that also sealed his fate. His body was found the next morning in an alley behind the general store, his throat cut from ear to ear, a note pinned to his chest that read, "Justice for Goliath, one of many." The killing of Deputy Carson sent shockwaves through Madison County and put the remaining conspirators on notice that the Deaton clan was not finished. Sheriff Garrett immediately requested reinforcements from the state, and within 2 weeks 20 additional deputies had been assigned to the county. They established checkpoints on every road, searched every building in Marshall and the surrounding towns, and offered a reward of $1,000 for information leading to the arrest of any member of the Deaton clan. But the mountains were vast, and the Deatons knew them better than anyone. The second and third killings came within days of each other. 2 deputies who had made the mistake of traveling together to what they thought was a secure location outside the county. They had rented a cabin in neighboring Buncombe County, believing that distance would provide safety. But the Deaton network extended further than anyone had imagined, and word of their location reached the clan within days of their arrival. Their bodies were found by the cabin's owner, shot multiple times, notes left with each that continued the grim count. Justice for Goliath, 2 of many. And then 3. The pattern was established, and the terror began to spread beyond the immediate targets. Deputies who had not been present at the Deaton farm began resigning their commissions, unwilling to risk their lives for a conflict they had not started. Businessmen who had invested in the road project suddenly discovered urgent business in other cities. Politicians who had pressured Sheriff Garrett into action found themselves unable to appear in public without armed guards. The killing of a horse had unleashed forces that no one had anticipated. Sheriff Garrett himself became the focus of an increasingly desperate defense. He barricaded himself in the county jail, surrounded by loyal deputies who rotated through shifts that ensured he was never unprotected. He ate and slept in the building, never venturing outside, convinced that the Deatons were watching every approach and waiting for an opportunity. His confidence, which had always been his defining characteristic, was replaced by a paranoia that his remaining deputies found increasingly difficult to manage. The 4th victim was found hanging from a bridge over the French Broad River, his body displayed where everyone traveling the main road would see it. He had been a county commissioner who had publicly supported the road project and who had dismissed concerns about the Deatons as the complaints of backward people who refused to accept progress. The note pinned to his chest was longer than the previous ones, explaining in detail why he had been targeted and warning others who held similar views that they were not safe. The message was clear. The Deatons' justice extended beyond those who had pulled triggers. The 5th and 6th victims died in a single night, killed in their beds in separate locations by attackers who had somehow bypassed the guards protecting them. One was a deputy who had been present at the Deaton farm. The other was a lawyer who had drafted the legal opinion that justified the sheriff's order to destroy Goliath. The precision of these killings demonstrated that the Deatons had informants inside the county's defensive apparatus, people who were providing information about guard schedules and security arrangements. Trust began to break down among the conspirators. That's right. The state of North Carolina responded to the crisis by deploying a company of militia to Madison County. Over 100 armed men tasked with restoring order and capturing the members of the Deaton clan. They established a headquarters in Marshall, commandeered buildings throughout the town, and began a systematic search of the surrounding mountains. The commander, a colonel named James Blackwood, had experience fighting irregular forces during Reconstruction and believed that military methods could succeed where civilian law enforcement had failed. The militia arrived in Madison County with considerable fanfare, marching through the streets of Marshall in formation, with flags flying and drums beating. Colonel Blackwood addressed the assembled townspeople, promising that order would be restored and that the murderers of the deputies would be brought to justice. His confidence was impressive, and for a brief moment, the businessmen and politicians who had caused the crisis allowed themselves to believe that their problems would soon be solved. The reality proved far more challenging than Blackwood had anticipated. His soldiers were accustomed to fighting enemies who wore uniforms and gathered in identifiable formations. The Deatons were farmers who looked exactly like every other farmer in the county, who worked their fields during the day and melted into the civilian population at night. There were no camps to raid, no supply lines to cut, no headquarters to capture. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, invisible until the moment he struck. The terrain compounded the militia's difficulties. The Blue Ridge Mountains were not like the relatively gentle landscapes where most of the soldiers had trained. The ridges rose steeply from the valley floors, covered with dense forests that limited visibility to a few yards in most places. The trails that connected one community to another were narrow and treacherous, easily blocked by fallen trees or washed out by mountain storms. Horses struggled on the steep slopes, and men who were not accustomed to the altitude found themselves gasping for breath after climbing a few hundred feet. But Colonel Blackwood quickly discovered that his military experience had not prepared him for the challenges of fighting an enemy that melted into the civilian population and could not be distinguished from ordinary farmers. The Deatons did not wear uniforms or gather in identifiable camps. They were everywhere and nowhere, their network of supporters extending throughout the county and beyond. Every person the militia encountered might be a spy. Every farmhouse might shelter an enemy. Every trail might lead to an ambush. The soldiers grew increasingly frustrated and increasingly aggressive. The militia's heavy-handed tactics alienated the local population and strengthened support for the Deaton clan. Soldiers who searched homes without warrants, who arrested people without evidence, who treated every mountain farmer as a potential enemy, created new grievances that pushed previously neutral families towards sympathy with the vendetta. The Deatons, who had once been seen as one family among many, became symbols of resistance to outside oppression. Their cause became the county's cause. By the fall of 1903, 10 men had died at the hands of the Deaton clan, and the vendetta showed no signs of slowing. The militia had failed to capture a single member of the family, had failed to disrupt their operations in any meaningful way, and had succeeded only in making the situation worse. Colonel Blackwood requested reinforcements and was denied. The state had other priorities, and the ongoing crisis in Madison County was becoming a political embarrassment that officials in Raleigh preferred to ignore. The killing of Sheriff William Garrett became one of the most celebrated acts of vigilante justice in North Carolina history. Garrett had remained barricaded in the county jail for over 4 months, protected by guards who had become increasingly slovenly as time passed without incident. He had begun to believe that the Deatons had given up on reaching him, that their attention had turned to easier targets, that perhaps he might survive this nightmare after all. He was wrong. The plan to kill Garrett had been in development since the first week of the vendetta, but the security around the jail had initially been too tight to penetrate. The Deatons had watched and waited, gathering intelligence about guard schedules, identifying weaknesses in the jail's defenses, and preparing for the moment when an opportunity would present itself. That moment came when the militia withdrew, taking with it the additional security that had made the jail virtually impregnable. The tunnel that provided access to the jail was a masterpiece of patient engineering. It began in the cellar of a hardware store that had been purchased by a Deaton sympathizer specifically for this purpose. The diggers worked only at night, removing soil bucket by bucket and disposing of it in locations throughout the town where its appearance would not raise questions. The tunnel extended over 60 feet, passing beneath the street and emerging in a storage room in the jail's basement that was rarely visited by the guards. On a cold October night, 3 members of the Deaton clan entered the tunnel and made their way to the storage room. They emerged into the jail after midnight, when only 2 guards were on duty, both of them drowsing at their posts after months of boredom. The intruders moved silently through the building, neutralizing the guards without killing them, and made their way to the cell where Garrett had made his home. They found Garrett asleep in a cell he had converted into living quarters, surrounded by the paperwork that documented his failed efforts to destroy the family that was now destroying him. They woke him before they killed him, wanting him to know who had come for him and why. According to the guards who survived the night, Garrett begged for his life, offered money, promised to resign his position and leave the state. His pleas fell on deaf ears. The Deatons had not come to negotiate. They had come to collect a debt that could only be paid in blood. The death of Sheriff Garrett created a crisis that reached the governor's office in Raleigh. 11 men were now dead, including the chief law enforcement officer of Madison County. The militia had proven ineffective. The remaining conspirators were in a state of near panic. Something had to be done, but no one could agree on what that something should be. Some officials advocated for a massive military intervention that would pacify the entire county. Others suggested negotiation, offering amnesty in exchange for an end to the killings. The debate continued while the bodies accumulated, and the Deatons, meanwhile, continued their methodical work. You see, the destruction of Sheriff Garrett and the paralysis of state authority created a window of opportunity that the Deaton clan exploited ruthlessly. The militia units that had been deployed to the county were withdrawn in disgrace. Their commanders blamed for a failure that had more to do with the nature of the conflict than with any tactical errors. The politicians who had pushed for aggressive action found themselves defending their decisions before increasingly skeptical colleagues, and the remaining men on the Deaton list found themselves suddenly without protection. The killings resumed in November and continued through the winter, a relentless campaign that eliminated every remaining conspirator the clan could locate. Deputies who had fled to other counties were tracked down and killed. Businessmen who had relocated to distant cities were found and punished. Politicians who had tried to disappear into private life discovered that the Deatons had long memories and extensive networks. Each killing demonstrated that nowhere was safe from the clan's justice. The 12th victim was a state legislator who had championed the road project from the beginning, believing that it would bring prosperity to the mountain communities. He had dismissed warnings about the Deatons as exaggerations, had insisted that no family of farmers could stand against the power of the state. He learned otherwise when he was shot through the window of his Raleigh townhouse, killed by a marksman who was never identified. The note left at the scene continued the count and warned other politicians that their offices would not protect them. The 13th and 14th victims died together, ambushed on a road in Tennessee where they had fled believing they were beyond the Deatons' reach. They had been deputies at the original confrontation, men who had fired on the Deaton positions and who had fled when the tide turned against them. They had traveled over 100 miles to escape, had changed their names, had started new lives in a place where no one knew their history. The Deatons found them anyway. The network that had tracked them included contacts throughout the Appalachian region, people who sympathized with the clan's cause and who reported any sightings of men matching the descriptions that had been circulated. The 15th victim was the man who had actually fired the shot that killed Goliath's sire, a breeding stallion that the Deatons had been planning to bring from Tennessee to improve their stock. This man had not been present at the original confrontation, but had participated in an earlier attempt to pressure the family by destroying their animals. His killing demonstrated that the Deatons' definition of conspiracy extended backward in time, that anyone who had contributed to the campaign against the family was liable for punishment, regardless of when their actions had occurred. By the spring of 1904, the death toll had reached 17, and the state of North Carolina was desperate for a resolution. the governor authorized a special prosecutor to investigate the original incident, hoping that official acknowledgement of wrongdoing might provide the basis for a negotiated settlement. The prosecutor's report, delivered in May, concluded that Sheriff Garrett had exceeded his authority, that the order to destroy Goliath had been legally unjustified, and that the deaths of the deputies at the original confrontation had been legitimate acts of self-defense. It was a stunning vindication of the Deaton position. But the vindication came too late to stop the vendetta. Old Jerry Deaton received the prosecutor's report with something approaching contempt, observing that official acknowledgement of injustice meant nothing when his horse was still dead, and his family had been forced to kill and die in defense of what was rightfully theirs. The remaining names on the list would still be crossed off, regardless of what any prosecutor might say. The state's belated admission of wrongdoing had not brought Goliath back, and it could not erase the blood that had been spilled. The 18th victim was found dead in his own bank, the president of the institution that had financed the road project and that had expected to profit handsomely from the increased land values along its route. He had believed himself immune to the Deatons' justice, protected by his wealth and his position, and the guards he had hired to ensure his safety. He was wrong. The killers had entered through a window on the second floor, had bypassed his guards without alerting them, and had executed him at his own desk. The note left with his body expressed the clan's contempt for those who thought money could protect them from accountability. The 19th and 20th victims died on the same night, killed in different counties by teams that had coordinated their actions to ensure both targets fell before word of either killing could spread. One was a former deputy who had participated in the original confrontation and who had fired at the Deaton positions during the battle. The other was a newspaper editor who had published editorials supporting the road project and condemning the Deatons as backward savages who stood in the way of progress. His killing sent a message that the clan would not tolerate those who used words to justify violence against mountain families. The coordination required for this double killing demonstrated the sophistication that the Deaton operation had achieved over the course of the vendetta. Teams in different locations communicated through a network of messengers who carried coded messages along mountain trails. They synchronized their actions to within an hour of each other, ensuring that the alarm raised by one killing would not provide warning for the target of the other. The planning had taken weeks, but the execution was flawless. The 20th killing created a brief pause in the vendetta as the clan assessed their progress and confirmed that only one name remained on the list. They had killed 19 men and had tracked down the locations of everyone else who bore responsibility for Goliath's death. Only Charles Morrison remained, the surveyor who had plotted the route of the contested road, and he had proven to be the most elusive target of all. Morrison had fled Madison County within days of the first killing, recognizing that his role in selecting the route through Deaton property made him a likely target. He had gone first to Asheville, then to Charlotte, then to Richmond, always staying one step ahead of the Deatons' network of informants. He changed his name multiple times, grew a beard, took menial jobs that would not require references or identification. For nearly a year, he managed to evade the family that was hunting him. But the Deatons were patient, and their network extended further than Morrison had imagined. A sympathizer in Roanoke recognized him from a description that had been circulating through the Appalachian region for months. Word reached Madison County within days, and a team was dispatched to complete the vendetta that had consumed the family for over a year. The 21st and final killing came in August 1904, more than a year after Goliath's death. The target was a man named Charles Morrison, who had been the surveyor responsible for plotting the route of the contested road. Morrison had selected the path through Deaton property, specifically because it would force the family to sell, a choice that he had made in consultation with the businessmen who were funding the project. He had fled to Virginia after the vendetta began, believing that crossing state lines would put him beyond the Deatons' reach. He was wrong. Morrison was found dead in a boarding house in Roanoke, shot once through the heart by a killer who had entered and exited without being seen by any of the other residents. The note pinned to his chest completed the count that had begun 15 months earlier. Justice for Goliath, 21 of 21. It is finished. The Deaton clan had kept their vow, had eliminated every man they held responsible for the attack on their farm and the death of their beloved horse. The vendetta was over. The aftermath of the Deaton vendetta reshaped Madison County in ways that lasted for generations. The road project that had started everything was quietly abandoned, its investors ruined and its political supporters discredited. The state legislature passed new laws restricting the authority of sheriffs to destroy animals without proper judicial process, laws that became known informally as the Goliath Acts. The power of the business interests that had controlled Madison County politics was broken, replaced by a more cautious approach that recognized the limits of outside authority in mountain communities. The Deaton clan itself emerged from the vendetta as something approaching local royalty. They had stood against the combined power of the sheriff, the state militia, and the business establishment, and they had won. Their willingness to fight and die for their property and their principles made them heroes to people throughout the region who had suffered similar injustices but had lacked the means or the courage to respond. The Deaton name became synonymous with resistance to outside oppression. No member of the Deaton clan was ever prosecuted for the killings that had claimed 21 lives over 15 months. The state, having acknowledged through the special prosecutor's report that the original confrontation had been provoked by illegal actions on the part of the sheriff, was in no position to pursue charges that would require relitigating questions it preferred to leave settled. A quiet amnesty was extended in 1906, officially closing the books on a case that had embarrassed everyone involved. The amnesty was controversial in some quarters, with editorial writers in Raleigh and Charlotte condemning what they saw as the state's surrender to murderers. But in the mountains of western North Carolina, the decision was welcomed as a belated acknowledgement that the Deatons had been defending themselves against an unjust attack. The corrupt officials who had killed Goliath and provoked the vendetta had paid for their crimes, and the system that had enabled them had been reformed. It was not perfect justice, but it was perhaps the best outcome that could be expected. The Deaton clan returned to their normal lives with a caution that gradually faded as years passed without consequence. The fields that had been neglected during the vendetta were plowed and planted again. Though the work was harder now without Goliath to pull the heavy equipment, the family eventually acquired other draft horses, good animals that served their purpose well, but none of them could replace the great Belgian stallion who had transformed the farm and whose death had transformed the family. The younger members of the clan who had participated in the killings found the transition to peacetime life difficult. They had spent over a year living by violence, making decisions that meant life or death for their targets, and the slow rhythms of farming seemed impossibly dull by comparison. Some of them drifted away from Madison County, seeking opportunities in cities where their restlessness might find more acceptable outlets. Most eventually returned, discovering that the mountains were in their blood in ways that no amount of wandering could change. Old Jerry Deaton lived another 8 years after the vendetta's conclusion, dying peacefully in his bed in 1912 at the age of 77. He was buried on the hill overlooking the farm he had spent his life working, in a grave next to his 2 wives, and not far from the massive mound that marked where Goliath lay. Over 1,000 people attended his funeral, representatives of families from throughout the region, who came to pay their respects to a man who had become a symbol of mountain independence and determination. The grave of Goliath became something of a pilgrimage site in the years following the vendetta, visited by people who wanted to see the place where the great horse had lived and died. The Deaton family maintained the site carefully, keeping the grass trimmed and placing flowers on certain anniversaries. A stone marker was eventually erected, bearing only the horse's name and dates, but everyone who visited knew the larger story. Goliath had been more than a horse. He had been a symbol, and his death had unleashed forces that transformed an entire county. The Deaton homestead remained in family hands throughout the 20th century, though each generation seemed to produce fewer children than the one before. The steep fields that Goliath had made workable were gradually abandoned as tractors replaced horses and farming methods changed. The barn where the great horse had lived was preserved as a kind of memorial, its walls still bearing the marks of the bullets that had been fired during the original confrontation. Visitors who made the difficult journey to the remote hollow could still see the stall where Goliath had stood, Still imagine the great horse in his prime. The story of the Deaton clan passed into legend almost immediately, becoming one of those tales that mountain people told around fires and passed down through generations. Songs were written about them, ballads that celebrated their loyalty to their horse and mourned the blood that had been spilled. Some portrayed them as heroes who had defended their property and their honor against corrupt officials. Others painted them as murderers who had killed far more men than any horse's life could justify. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any simple narrative could capture. The songs that emerged from the Deaton story varied widely in their approach and their message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, beginning with Goliath's arrival on the farm and ending with the final killing. Others focused on particular moments, dramatizing the original confrontation or the assassination of Sheriff Garrett. The most famous of these songs, known simply as Goliath, was composed in 1906 by a blind musician named Thomas Whitley, who had heard the story from Deaton family members themselves. His song has been recorded by dozens of artists over the past century and remains a standard in the Appalachian folk repertoire. Historians who have studied the Deaton case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and its meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of class conflict, with the business interests represented by the road project clashing against the traditional mountain communities that stood in their way. Others have focused on the legal and political failures that allowed the situation to escalate from a property dispute to a mass killing. Still others have examined the role of animal bonds in rural societies, seeing in the Deatons' response to Goliath's death evidence of relationships between humans and animals that modern urban dwellers can barely comprehend. You see, what the Deaton clan did cannot be justified by any conventional moral framework, cannot be excused or explained away or fitted neatly into categories of right and wrong. They killed 21 men, some of whom bore heavy responsibility for the attack on their property, and some of whom played only minor roles in the conspiracy. They terrorized an entire region for over a year, creating widows and orphans who suffered just as they had suffered. The violence they committed was disproportionate by any reasonable measure, extending far beyond what even the most generous interpretation of justice could require. And yet their story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of madness and murder that teaches only the obvious lesson that violence is wrong. They were a family who watched their beloved animal killed by corrupt officials who faced no accountability through legal channels. The courts that should have protected their property rights had been purchased by those with money and power. The law enforcement officials who should have upheld justice had become instruments of oppression. What response could a society expect from people so completely betrayed by every institution designed to provide protection and recourse? Their story challenges us to consider what we ourselves might do in similar circumstances, what any family might do when faced with such impossible loss and such complete absence of legitimate justice. It offers no comfortable conclusions, no clean moral lessons, only the raw fact of human capacity for both cruelty and consequence. The conspirators who killed Goliath never imagined that their action would result in 21 deaths and the destruction of everything they had built. The Deatons never imagined that their lives would be defined by violence when the deputies rode up to their farm on that May morning. All of them were swept up in forces larger than themselves. The specific circumstances that produced the Deaton tragedy have changed in the decades since their vendetta ended. The road projects that once threatened mountain communities are now generally welcomed as connections to broader opportunities. The political machines that controlled county governments have been reformed, at least partially, by changes in law and shifts in public expectation. The draft horses that once powered mountain farms have been replaced by tractors and trucks, their role in agricultural life relegated to history. But the underlying dynamics that created the conflict have not disappeared entirely. The relationship between rural communities and outside authorities remains fraught with tension in many parts of America. Government agencies still sometimes act in ways that seem designed to serve powerful interests rather than ordinary citizens. Corporate entities still sometimes use their political connections to override the rights of those who lack similar influence. The story of the Deaton clan serves as a reminder of what can happen when these dynamics are allowed to continue unchecked. When the gap between justice as it should be and justice as it is becomes too wide for people to accept. The descendants of the Deaton clan still live in those North Carolina hills, carrying a name that evokes both pride and burden. Some have embraced the family legacy, researching the history and preserving the stories for future generations. Others have tried to distance themselves, uncomfortable with the violence that made their ancestors famous. All of them, in one way or another, have been shaped by events that occurred more than a century ago. A vendetta that defined their family in ways that cannot be escaped or forgotten. The hollow where the Deaton homestead once stood remains in family hands to this day, though the original cabin has been replaced by more modern structures. The barn where Goliath lived and died still stands, preserved by descendants who understand its significance. The grave on the hillside is still maintained, still visited by people who remember the story and want to pay their respects to an animal whose death changed history. The mountains themselves remain, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The mountains of Madison County remain today much as they were in 1903, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The creeks still flow cold and clear, the trees still change color each autumn, the hollows still shelter families whose names have been associated with this land for generations. The county seat has grown into a small city, but the backcountry remains remote and difficult to access. Those who live there still tell stories about the Deaton clan, about the vendetta and its consequences, about what happens when outsiders push mountain people too far. The story of the Deaton clan endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of loyalty, and what that loyalty becomes when it is tested beyond all reasonable limits. It is the story of corruption and its consequences, of systems that fail the people they are supposed to serve, and people who respond to that failure in the most terrible ways possible. It is the story of the bond between humans and animals, and what happens when that bond is violated by those who do not understand its depth. It is, finally, a story without heroes or villains, only humans caught in circumstances that reveal both the best and worst of what we are capable of becoming. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where the Deaton clan stood, to see the hollow they defended, and the grave where their beloved Goliath rests beneath a stone that bears his name? Would you walk the paths they walked, breathe the same mountain air, feel the same wind that has blown through these hills since before humans came to settle here? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the hollow itself is difficult to access without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it, that standing in that place and knowing that history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs. The mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of the Deaton clan close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows and the countless other stories of those who have lived and died among these ancient peaks. Their story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in Madison County in 1903, as long as families defend their own with a ferocity that defies reason, as long as systems fail and people find ways to respond. They are gone now, dust mingling with the earth of the hollow they loved, but what they did and what was done to them echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. And that, my friend, is the true story of the Deaton clan, who slaughtered 21 lawmen after they shot their giant workhorse Goliath on a spring day in 1903, a story of love and loss, of corruption and vengeance,